welcome friends to the next session in the series Posthuman Transformation. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and today I'll be talking about Chapter 3. These are just teaser introductions, and as in my series of Jesus Deus, they're really meant to encourage you to see if you're interested enough in purchasing the book, in which case you can follow along using these videos as kind of intros. You can use these videos however you'd like, however, and I encourage questions and comments. There is a special deal on the book for patrons, so let me know if you're interested in getting a signed copy from me. Stock is limited, so let me know soon. So, Chapter 3 is called Plato and the Moralization of Demonification. And for those of you who've read the book, you'll know that Plato is really the hinge of the book. And in many ways, my reading of becoming a daemon in the Greek tradition is a Platonized reading. Because I think that the moralization, specifically the moralization of becoming pure, is really something that Plato made clear. So, for instance, in Hesiod, Plato knows both Hesiod and Empedocles, and in Hesiod, the golden generation is golden as if by nature they are simply good human beings, the first human beings who are good. And in Empedocles, humans go through this process of moral, or I should say physical evolution, by being reincarnated in every life form, and then emerging as human, and then emerging as something greater than human after many lifetimes and many occupations. Well, for Plato, he takes reincarnation from Pythagoras and Empedocles, and he works with it as a kind of working hypothesis. But what he really wants to emphasize is that as we're evolving, that purification, it is more than just a religious purification. It's more than just abstaining from meat and animal products, living souls. It's about actually attaining virtue. And defining what that virtue is something that the Greeks gave us. They codified what they meant by virtue, Aristotle being the most famous codifier and most famous disciple of Plato. So if you remember back in the chapter on Hesiod, I talked about individuals who were demonified because of their special relationship with a fully fledged god. And this is the case with Phaethon and political rulers. It's the case with Orphic initiates who try to forge a relationship with Dionysus, and specifically Dionysus's mother, Persephone in this case. For Plato, there's a kind of democratization, because once you open daemonification to a large group, or to anyone who is virtuous, then you potentially open that up to a very large group of people. So the thesis of the chapter is really that Plato made purification a matter of gaining moral and political virtue. And of course, Plato is the one who defines what moral and political virtue are, but that's a bit of a floating signifier, and in each and every age, morality and what is considered virtuous shifts and changes a bit. But the important thing for Plato is that only the good, the beneficent, those who help, those who protect and those who care, not just for themselves, but for the whole political unit, these are the ones who become daimones. And as Plato works out in each individual dialogue what he means, we see different emphases. So we've got to take each individual dialogue on its own, And I encourage everybody, if they have the time, to refresh their knowledge of Plato, and maybe consider reading one or several of the dialogues mentioned here entirely, just so you get the context. The main character in most of Plato's dialogues is, of course, Socrates, his teacher. We don't know how really close they were in real life, and Plato and Socrates were very different. But one of the things that became clear later on is that there were different versions of Socrates depending on who you asked. Socrates died in 399, and when Plato started writing, he more and more put his own ideas into the mouth of Socrates. But one of the things that the tradition agreed on was that Socrates had something called a daemonion. And this daemonion was, according to Plato's Symposium, sort of like a voice inside Socrates' head that told him not to do things, not to do certain things. And he always obeyed this voice, and it always turned out well for him. And what's interesting is, obviously this is open to interpretation what exactly this was, but the daemonion evidently is not really something that was separate from Socrates' consciousness. It was itself sort of his higher consciousness, his higher self. And it was by following that he could then distinguish this higher self from his, other elements, or his lower self, as it were, his flesh. And he argued, according to Plato, that on his deathbed, that we are our souls. And he had a series of arguments showing why the soul would exist after death. And although the daemonion is not brought in that particular dialogue, disappointingly, it is brought in several other dialogues, which we will now talk about. Plato's Symposium is a favorite dialogue of many people because it's very fun. It's about 6 men at an after dinner party getting drunk and telling not love stories, but speeches in honor of the god love. And eventually the party is crashed by one of Socrates' would-be disciples, and it turns out into something like mayhem. But before this happens, Socrates himself is giving a speech, and he attributes most of his learning to a female prophetess, as it were, called Diotima. And in this speech attributed to Diotima, a daimon is carefully defined as a being of mid-grade status, a being who is like a ferryman, who shuttles prayers up above and then, going from down to back to earth, gives or bestows divine gifts from the higher gods, as it were. And these are the beings who were supposedly in control of the institutional religions. And so these were the beings who, in Plato's day, received the sacrifices of animals and gave the oracles from the temples, and were the subjects of the spells. And so they are the middle management class. But the middle management class for Plato is something good. It's not bad. They are good beings. They aren't the good. They are striving toward good. They desire the good. And that's why Eros is Eros. He's always, that's why Cupid is always striving to fulfill his love. Love is always striving to be complete by being linked with the beloved. And it's that desire for the beloved, the desire for something good, that shows that Eros, or Cupid, is himself a daemon. When we shift to Plato's Republic, this is a shift toward the political, because the point of the Republic is to imagine or dream out the ideal city of, what is the truly just city? What is the city which corresponds to justice? And how is justice in the soul related to justice in the city? These are the main questions of the Republic, or the Politeia. And in this dialogue, daemonification is granted to those who exemplify distinctly political virtue, and Plato specifically mentions courage in war. So the great soldiers who die as heroes on the battlefield, these are the ones that are daemonified, and these are the ones that are given a state called after death. And there's some question, I think, as to whether Plato is being pragmatic here, and he doesn't really believe that people become daimones. But from other dialogues, it's fairly clear that he does believe that people become daimones. So the state cult is something real, or corresponds to something real, and is not just a matter of political justification. After death, these daimones become protectors of the state, and it's not just soldiers who receive this honor. For Plato, it's the philosopher kings, who are themselves called guardians or phylakes, who, when they die, they are also daemonified, or recognized as daemonic, and they become guardians, the chief guardians, as it were, of the state, the deified heroes, but specifically the daemonified ones, because of course they don't replace the state gods, but become part of the middle management, as it were. Plato's Cratylus is a dialogue about language, and tries to understand the meaning of words through their etymology. And so if you love that sort of stuff, I would suggest this one. In this dialogue, daemonification is really democratized. It becomes available to anyone who exercises virtuous deeds on earth. It's not just meant for a certain political class or anything of that sort. And one of the greatest virtues is not just courage for Plato, it's wisdom. And so he specifically highlights wise persons or sages as those who are recipients of daemonification, and they seem to be recognized as daimones, perhaps even on earth, before their death. And Plato reaches back to the poetic language and finds this word daemon, which means one who knows, as a sage, as it were. And he says that this is the origin of the term demon. Now, he's probably not right in the etymology, but this is a sort of a playful dialogue, and he's just trying to make a point and naturalize it, as it were, in the language. So finally, the Timaeus, one of Plato's middle dialogues, gives us a different story about the daimon, which circles us back and makes a nice inclusio with Socrates. In the Timaeus, which is a creation story where we see Plato's demiurge or creator, who is also a good being, trying to make the best of all possible worlds, according to the model. This creator makes human beings, and each human being has a pre-existent nous, that is, mind, and we are all embodied. And the highest part of this mind is the daimon. Plato seemed to refer to it as the higher soul. And everyone is allotted a daimon as a higher self, as a kind of guardian or protector, a guardian angel, as it were. But the guardian angel isn't separate from the self. It's called a roommate or a synoikon of the self. And in the end, the point, again, is to become morally good so that one fully identifies with that higher self. Just like Socrates. So in effect, everyone has a daimonion, and in that respect, everyone is like Socrates. And so Socrates, the model of daemonification, is, again, his special gift. The daimonion is universalized And so this is how the daemonification as fully democratized and fully moralized comes to fruition. So Plato himself died at the end of the 4th century BCE, well over 400 years before the birth of Jesus. And as a sort of poetic justice, Plato was, in the course of decades and centuries, himself daemonized. And it was said of him, according to tradition, that as he lay dying, he sang a hymn of thanksgiving to his own daemon. And we're told by later sources that an oracle sanctioned the veneration of Plato's soul as a daemon, and he was viewed by Apuleius as a hero, and by Atticus as having a divine nature. These are later Platonists, and specifically a daimonic nature. So these are the traditions that Plato himself got what he wrote about, and in effect he wrote himself into his own daemonification. So in closing, I just want to thank everyone for coming along. Again, this is chapter 3 in my book, Posthuman Transformation in Ancient Mediterranean Thought. I hope you'll pick up the book and read the notes to get all of the source information and all of the rich detail that is there for you to access. I really appreciate your time. Leave a like and a comment if you have one, and I will see you next time.